The webinar will begin in 2 minutes.
Greetings from Singapore. My name is Morikawa Toru, the Executive Director of the Asia Europe Foundation, ASEF. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our first webinar under the Human Rights Seminar series on access to education and human rights education in times of COVID-19 moving forward. After the 19th Informal ASEM Seminar on human rights. The webinar continues the conversation from the said seminar, which pertain to human rights education and training. It was held in northern Norway, Tromsø, in November last year, and it brought together over 120 Asian and European government representatives and civil society experts to discuss education and training about human rights and what can be done to further strengthen the implementation of and access to human rights education at the ASEM level. The seminar highlighted that, in spite of clear commitments made by states in Asia and Europe to uphold human rights education, its implementation has been precarious and contingent on access to education in general. At the same time, the meeting recognized that the right to education and to human rights education are conditioned by access to other rights, including economic, social, cultural, as well as political rights. Some groups are disadvantaged in their access to learning opportunities. Learners with disabilities, those in minority or disadvantaged communities, refugee students, and those in remote areas are at high risk of having their right to education denied. With this in mind, and given the COVID-19 pandemic, which has further disrupted the education of millions of children and youth globally. The webinar aims to assess the impact COVID-19 has had on access to education and discuss how the disruption in learning and access to schooling have affected the continuity of education and further deepen inequalities. It also aims to address possible ways to strengthen support for educators, trainers, and others working in the education sector to ensure continuity of safe and inclusive learning for all, and ultimately to ensure continuity of human rights education. I would like to thank our distinguished speakers and the moderator for sharing their expertise and continuing this conversation with us. I would also like to thank our very international audience for making the time to attend this session. I wish you all a very successful webinar. I am delighted to introduce our moderator, Professor Emeritus at the Faculty of Law, Chulalongkorn University, a renowned human rights expert and a recipient of the UNESCO Human Rights Education Prize, Professor Lilith Munterbom. Professor Munterbom has helped the UN, United Nations, in a variety of positions, including as UN Special Rapporteur, UN Independent Expert, and member of UN Commissions of Inquiry on Human Rights. Besides teaching international law and human rights, Professor Munterbom has been involved in many human rights education programs for judges, government officials, and civil society, locally and internationally. Professor, now you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, everyone in Asia, Europe, and beyond. It's a real pleasure to be here to accompany you on this little journey this afternoon of 1.5 hours discussion on a very important topic of the day, the right to education and human rights education in times of COVID, particularly from the angle of access. First of all, I'd like to thank ASEF very much for inviting us to be on board, particularly the executive director who's just spoken, and the team, including Ani, who's behind the scenes organizing. And I'm very honored to have the chance to be on board with you today, particularly just as a little facilitator with a few points to bear in mind, first of all. Number one, we have 1.5 hours. So it's a bit economical, but we're going to invite you to participate as much as possible. And if you do speak, particularly the panelists, you can switch on the microphone, but then mute once we're not speaking. And secondly, the participants from all over, you're most welcome to send in questions on Q&A. And I've already been looking at some of them that you've been sending in, 2 or 3 that have just arrived now. So you're most welcome. And we bear in mind the pre-questions that were sent in beforehand as well, about 35 of them, which we'll look to and then try to air with the panelists in a moment. Thirdly, the program itself is one being recorded. So we invite you to bear that in mind, and also to be respectful of each other's views. It's an open forum, and we're very respectful of a variety of opinions. And with that in mind, I will now come to the session itself in terms of introducing the panelists. But before I go to the panelists, I'd like to give you a little inkling of what it's about. The most recent statistics from the UN of disruption, children not being able to go to school or learners not being able to learn generally, is 1.6 billion. 1.6 billion people, according to UN statistics last month, being disrupted in terms of access to education. So it's a calamity, it's a catastrophe in a certain way, but we are also here to try to look to opportunities, a sense of hope in discussing the path to the future. And I'd like to give you 2 or 3 examples of hope. In the media this week, there was a report from one Southeast Asian country where children were climbing up trees to catch the Wi-Fi on their mobile to study. Now, that's a very brave gesture of people who really want to learn. And I think we're now realizing that we really want to learn much more. And we lost what we lost, unfortunately, but we're trying to recover it. Another inkling of a good opportunity is the mosque. The mosque, the church, the mosque in a certain country is offering free Wi-Fi. And in the disruption, can't go to school, but the teacher has been going out to visit 3 or 4 children once in a while, taking school to them rather than enabling them to come to school at the moment. So these are opportunities, and we are looking very much forward to learning from our experts concerning where do we go. And we're not going to give up, but we're going to emphasize what's going to be doable and emphatically try to realize and attain the right to education and human rights education. So with that in mind, let me now turn to our speakers. And after hearing them, we'll have 2 rounds of questions, bearing in mind the questions that have been sent in already. And we have 3 very eminent speakers here, and I will introduce them briefly and then enable them to have about 10 minutes each to enlighten us on their angles. The first speaker is Dr. Siprapar Petmisi, an old friend, who is a senior lecturer at the Human Rights Studies program of Mahidol University in Thailand. And she's very well known to many of you. I'll just quote a few of her achievements. She was a member of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. She's currently the co-chair of the Civil Society Working Group for an ASEAN Human Rights Mechanism. She also chairs the study group known as Shape Southeast Asia, which covers Southeast Asia in terms of human rights and peace education. And very importantly, she was one of the 2 rapporteurs of the Tromsø conference that was mentioned recently. Secondly, we have Frank Elvis, who's from the University of Bucharest, who's had enormous experience in Europe and beyond, working on many programs in Eastern Europe, Middle East, etc. And he was, for a long time, also executive director of the international NGO Human Rights Education Associates organization, handling particularly human rights courses and gender mainstreaming. And he's also served as the chair of the Democracy and Human Rights Education in Europe network, particularly for the past decade. And importantly, also, Frank was one of the co-rapporteurs at the Tromsø conference. And finally, thirdly, last but not least, our friend Anna Perone Feldstad, who's from the European Wegeland Center, and she's the executive director with enormous experience in terms of working with the Council of Europe, working with UNESCO, working with NGOs, and also working with South America, particularly Argentina, in terms of human rights program. So with those in mind, I will now invite Dr. Siprapar for about 10 minutes to please set the ball rolling. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajahn, for your kind introduction. Before I start, I'd just like to notify again that it's raining very heavily at my place, so you may hear the noise actually. But first of all, I would like to thank the Asia Europe Foundation for initiating this very timely seminar. My thanks are also extended to the whole team and the Secretariat for all facilitation. I got 10 minutes to share 10 points, including a quotient and a conclusion. And these points are based on the report of the discussions which took place, as mentioned a few times, in Tromsø last year, as well as other relevant documents, particularly UNESCO, UNICEF reports, and few academic pieces. The 10 points examine the issues surrounding access to education and human rights education for pre, during, and post-COVID-19. First, I would like to emphasize that access to education is a basic right recognized by a number of international human rights treaties, as well as national laws, including constitutions of many countries in Asia and Europe. Second, as already pointed out by Professor Witit, COVID-19 actually creates an unprecedented disruption to education system around the globe. The UNESCO reports issued in August 2020 reveal that pandemics affects nearly 1.6 billion learners in more than 190 countries and all continents. Closures of schools and other learning spaces have impacted 94% of the world's students' population, up to 99% in low and lower middle income countries. Third, in the same time, this how crisis has stimulated prompt creation and innovation, as we just heard, in support of education and training continuity. Distance and online learning are introduced to address the sudden change caused by the COVID-19. Indeed, in many ways, we, especially in the formal education system, were forced to practice online learning, some things we were otherwise hesitating to adopt before the pandemic. Fourth, but we know that online learning as an alternative, not a panacea. Online remote teaching and learning became almost the only alternative to traditional face-to-face classroom learning because of the lockdown and social distancing. In one of the most recent researches conducted by Shivangi Dhawan, University of Delhi in India, she identifies various strengths and opportunities as well as weaknesses and challenges attached to online learning. Education is no longer time-bound, but we see time flexibility, location flexibility, catering to wide range of audience, viability of courses and contents with immediate feedback, which means that in principle, education is made accessible anytime, anywhere, and to anyone. As I said, in principle. Online learning creates a lot of opportunities as it provides scope for innovation and digital development, flexibility in designing programs, strengthening skills of problem solving, critical thinking, and of adaptability. Users can be of any age, and these, in some ways, present radical transformation in all aspects of education. However, online and remote learning carries with it weaknesses such as technical difficulties, dependence on learners' capability and confidence level, requirements of time management, distractions, frustration, anxieties, confusion, and definitely lack of personal physical interaction. It brings a number of challenges, including unequal distribution of ICT infrastructure, something that I think my good friend Frank will be talking about, but also quality of education, digital literacy, digital divide, as well as technology costs and obsolescence. Weaknesses and challenges are particularly felt in developing countries. In South Asia, for instance, only 3 countries have over 80% internet penetration, with Singapore leading the statistic, followed by Brunei and Malaysia. For countries like Indonesia, only 56% of its 260 million population have access to internet. Others such as Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam have less than 40% internet penetration. Many students in South Asia are from economically vulnerable families. Their access to computers are limited to school-provided computers lab, and many do not have access to unlimited internet on their mobile devices. We heard just now again. Finally, internet-based learning is still an elitist education learning approach, excluding certain segments of the society. As already mentioned by Executive Director of the Asia Europe Foundation in Tromsø, the meeting identified groups of people who are traditionally excluded from access to education, be they stateless persons, asylum seekers, migrants, refugees, and more. The COVID-19 just exacerbates pre-existing education disparities and inequalities by further reducing the opportunities for the already marginalized and disadvantaged groups. 6. Access to education requires access to knowledge and communication. Governments must put their efforts to open licensing and open access policies. And I think this is one thing that we will have to talk about, that facilitate no-cost use, reuse, repurposing, and adaptation. Open education resources must be prioritized. Public education cannot be dependent on digital platforms provided by private companies. 7, there is also a need for redefining and liberating education. Expansion of understanding of right to education beyond schools and students to cover learners of all ages. It needs much more fluid approaches to learning as a continuum in which any formal education institutions interact more closely with other less formalized education experience from early age. So the idea of a single standardized educational institution model needs to be replaced by a variety of ways of doing schools. One that might be very different from the school model, consolidated across the globe. UNESCO actually recommends flexible forms, flexible times, shared educational commitments, and an understanding of ways that learning is broadly diffused across temporary societies. Learning has to be liberated from being restricted to fixed and predetermined location. Again, in Tromsø, as already mentioned by Executive Director, the issue of access to human rights education was discussed. And one conclusion was that access to human rights education is contingent on access to education, and that both rights are conditioned by access to other rights, including academic, social, cultural, as well as political rights. With the pandemic, one of the most important rights emerged during this pandemic, right to internet. We don't talk much about that. So the notion of right to education needs to include right to internet to ensure connectivity. I would like to end with a caution and a conclusion. My caution is we must ensure that digitalization does not undermine privacy, free expression, informational self-determination, or lead to abusive surveillance. So it is an illusion to think that online learning is the way forward for all. A conclusion, I like to quote the report of International Commission on the Futures of Education, entitled Education in the Post-COVID World. And it says, education is a fundamental and universal right. Societies should make every effort to sustain it by any means necessary. States which are recognized under international law as duty bearers for fulfilling the right to education bear responsibility to facilitate and provide education, as well as respect and protect the rights of education to education. In this time of disruption, we have seen how difficult it is to ensure the availability of functioning educational institutions and programs. All parties must commit to ensuring that any retrogression is temporary, truly prompted by emergency conditions, and redressed as soon as that becomes possible, so that the recent decades of progress are not undone, and so that 2020s do not become a decade of lost opportunities. And I would add here, my last point, the SDG for Education 2020 agenda should not be pushed back. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wide range of very thoughtful reflections, which I'm sure we're going to take up in terms of the disparities, but also the opportunities that are offered along the way. Now I come to our friend Frank, please, for an elaboration of the technological side and its challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Munterborn, for giving me the floor and for moderating this panel debate. Thank you, of course, to the Asia Europe Foundation, Mr. Morikawa and his staff for organizing this webinar. And thank you to everyone who has joined today in such large numbers. It shows that not only you have a great interest and dedication to human rights and human rights education, but you're also not tired yet of Zoom meetings, which I find very encouraging, as during the pandemic, Zoom has become sort of a universal tool to help us collaborate and learn online. Let me play devil's advocate. I concur with Dr. Suprafa that access to education is a major challenge during the coronavirus and pandemic. And she's given many examples, numbers of how, in particular, vulnerable children and communities are being deprived of education through the digital divide, through lack of connectivity. And this is something that we need to be very concerned about indeed. However, I would actually claim that the coronavirus pandemic, in a way, has been a blessing in disguise of sorts for education and human rights education, especially in higher education, continuing education, and professional development, which I will focus on in my presentation. Let me explain what I mean by this. Are forced, because most education providers have been forced, to venture into e-learning, actually help us to move beyond the classroom, beyond the seminar room, and beyond the lecture hall. It helps us to move away what Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator and philosopher, who by many is seen as someone who laid the foundation for the pedagogy of human rights education, what he called the banking model of education. By this banking model of education, he meant the traditional education system, which considers students as sort of containers into which educators must put their knowledge. And Freire argued that unless students own their learning process, it actually reinforces lack of critical thinking, which can turn into oppression or reinforce oppression. In contrast to Freire's understanding of knowledge as the result of a human creative process. Now, e-learning, including mobile learning, offers the possibility to focus more on self-learning, which increases ownership of learning. It offers the opportunity to focus on competencies and tailored education for individual learners, taking into account their different learning styles. It also offers the possibility of doing simulations, mentoring, on-the-job coaching, just as Freire would have liked to see it. Let me share a few examples with you. At the 19th ASEM Human Rights Seminar in Tromsø in Norway last November, we recommended that online teaching tools on human rights need to be used more in higher education systems, particularly in Asia, where universities still tend to rely on traditional teaching methods. And because of COVID-19, we see progress on this. Since the beginning of the pandemic, most universities were forced to offer courses online, including human rights courses, human rights moot courts. And as my dear colleague, Dr. Suprafa has pointed out, this of course has been a challenge for educators. It's been a major disruption for university, but most of them did manage, although the quality of teaching was not always as good as it could have been. But university instructors are learning quickly for the next semester. They are much familiar with the various tools and how they can offer their courses to organize their learning, their curricula in both online and blended mode. And what you've also seen, and maybe some of you are familiar with the Moodle learning platform, but universities have taken to Moodle, this learning system, in huge numbers. Just 50,000 new Moodle platforms have been registered since March of this year. There were 4.5 million users of the Moodle app in April, compared to 1.3 million in the same month last year. So that's almost 4 times as much. And Zoom, which we are using for this webinar, had 200 million daily meeting participants in March, which increased to 300 million in April, compared to just 10 million in December of last year. Just to give you a sense of the scale of how people have moved online. The Global Campus for Human Rights, based in Venice, for example, have been offering a blended master's program in human rights for many years and saw its enrollments double over the past months. Let me give you another example of professional education in human rights that has really thrived over the past months. In September, early September, 60 candidate judges and prosecutors in North Macedonia on the Western Balkans took a course with HELP, which is a human rights education for legal professionals program on the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court. And they, with the help of tutors, these judges and prosecutors in training had the opportunity to advance their knowledge on the structure and the interpretation of the European Convention of Human Rights, which is the main human rights treaty in Europe, the functioning of the court, as well as the process and the execution of the judgments by the court. And since March this year, more than 3,000 legal professionals in Europe enrolled in the self-directed version of this course on their online platform. And this is very much in line with one of the recommendations adopted at the ASEM seminar in November, which suggests, and I quote, "Consider the application of innovative blended learning programs by ASEM governments and professional associations, especially countries in Asia, to strengthen human rights knowledge of judges, lawyers, and prosecutors," unquote. Another example, an often forgotten and ignored target group of human rights education training are government officials. According to international human rights obligations, all law enforcement officials, teachers, health workers, social workers, and others acting on behalf of the state have a responsibility to respect and protect human rights. Hence, during the seminar in November, we recommended that states should double their efforts to ensure that all state officials have access to human rights training relevant to their responsibilities. Well, aside from teachers who've done a heroic job in getting up to speed and moved their classrooms online, and my colleague panelist Anna Perone will speak more about this, little has happened in this area in the past 6 months, both in Asia and Europe, as governments have been preoccupied with responding to the pandemic. Yet I would like to point out that particularly for health professionals and social workers, knowledge of human rights, including the right to health and the accompanying ethical dilemmas, are important during this pandemic. Let me finally say a few words about how we can start closing the so-called implementation gap. By implementation gap, I mean that despite all the existing legal frameworks, policies, procedures, resources, including open education resources, not enough human rights education is being realized on the ground, in the classroom and beyond the classroom and lecture hall. And to address this implementation gap, more coordination and coherence is needed among all actors who are involved in human rights education, from law and policy makers to school boards, from educators to professional associations, police academies to institutions of higher learning and human rights NGOs. And for this, there's a tool, if you will, which are called National Plans of Human Rights Education, and which can be a useful vehicle to ensure such coordination and coherence at the national level. And national human rights educations, which most of you may have heard of, can take the lead in this. And they can bring together all stakeholders and ensure that all these institutions that provide education training in, about, and for human rights coordinate their curricula and set targets for a certain time frame. In sum, the pandemic is an opportunity to finally get serious about the possibilities of e-learning for human rights. Quality, blended learning, move out of the classroom and closer to the digital reality of many students and professionals in Asia and Europe.
Thank you very much. That's a very useful panorama of the technological challenge, which is also posed as an opportunity for us. Thank you. Next is Anna, please. Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon, and I would like to thank ASEF for inviting me. I'm very honored by this. My topic is how is the supporting of education professionals in the time of COVID. I would say the first thing is that what we are experiencing that happens overnight, that when all the schools close and teachers were asked to work remotely, is a crisis response. It's a response to a crisis which not necessarily follows all of the principles and the methods of e-learning, which also is basically emergency education delivered, at least in most European countries, online. So it represents, I agree with Frank, this represents an opportunity, but also a risk. The opportunity is because we are all new beginners, we are all experiencing new things, and so the kind of the fear to the online learning maybe is diminished, but the risk is that we stay there with an experiment without really understanding what is the potential for delivering human rights education online, without exploring and really understanding what this could be for us. Then I would also refer to the gaps, as my previous colleagues did, and I just would like to put some numbers to that. I have one slide I would like to show. Well, the first thing is that because of this situation, the structural differences existing that require systemic answer will be exacerbated. Probably it's the inequalities are growing, and particularly the access to education will be increased. So that means that we need to really think in responses to that. And I would like to say that globally, when we are thinking schools working remotely, from the poorest countries, only less than 25% were able to provide any type of education, less than 25%, while in the rich countries were 90%. And what we are talking about a digital divide and connectivity and access to computers. Just to put a number to that, 1 out of 10 in the US do not have access to a computer. We are talking about the richest country in the world. So imagine the rest. We are also talking about that 20% of all students in OECD countries do not have access to a quiet place to study, what this disruption means for them. And it's not just between countries. You would see there a chart from April this year, 2020, just showing the differences within countries between advantaged schools and disadvantaged schools. So this pandemic is posing a really challenge for how to address these vulnerable groups that were vulnerable from before, that probably will be left behind even more. The second gap I would like to talk about is the empowerment gap, is how prepared were education professionals to go online or to different types of devices overnight. And again, I would like to bring some figures to you. In the last PISA from 18, 60% of 15-year-old students were attending schools whose principals said the teachers were missing the technical and pedagogical skills to use digital devices in their instruction. So we are talking about a massive need to support the improvement of the skills of teachers. It's not just a technological, but pedagogical. How are we going just to use digital means in the classroom to improve quality education, and in our case, particularly quality human rights education for all? That's where one of the main issues are. The second part is if teachers are supposed to deliver education online and human rights educations online, is about the issues having enough relevant online materials. It's not just enough to take some PDFs and a lot of text and put it online, because they need to be designed in a different way. They need conceptualized in a different way. Some feedback, and Professor Vitti talked about opportunities, and as many others, we have to go online overnight, and we are working in 26 countries. So we have a number of reflections and feedback from the teachers, because we were using some blended learning approaches, but suddenly everything was online. And what did we learn from that experience, again, working with teachers in a number of countries? The first thing is that it was quite challenging to get the teachers' attention to do human rights education, because there was a lot of stress on delivering on core subjects, the important ones. So we have to argue our case. And what we learn also is that through using of human rights education approaches, we actually could support teachers to do their job. And 4 points. The first one is that by using interactive approaches, which are typical to what we do, it helped teachers to keep students motivated, to keep students engaged. For instance, we compile a number of tips and a number of advices how to do that by using games and polls just at the beginning of the class and so on. So students were there because the teachers were fearing that the students would disappear, you know, just behind their screen, but not really engaging. So by doing this, using these methods, the students were there, and the teachers feel empowered because they were kind of cool. You know, they were engaging, they were fun, they were asking students to have an opinion on certain issues, or how do we going to proceed in the next days, or a number of ways. So stronger motivations for students. Second, teachers said that human rights education approaches help them a lot in developing the competencies in students. Competencies we are talking about how to cope with the future. It's about critical thinking, it's about developing students' autonomous learning competencies to manage their own learning, conflict resolution skills, collaboration skills. So the teachers use all these human rights approaches that through human rights, more than the topics, to do math, to do language, to do physics. This was very, very helpful for them. The other element is that the schools that were using this whole school approach we have been advocating for so long, particularly homeschool corporations, they did great. And this is something that also we see with experts and leaders. 75% of our leaders were saying that the cooperation between the schools and the parents is absolutely critical to manage the crisis. So what we see is also that this is an opportunity for, after the pandemic is gone, also for schools to realize how important parents can be when working with you as an ally for the learning of children, but also for parents to have an insight on the skills that are needed in teaching and learning. So it's an opportunity to really reinforce that. Even though 75% of experts said that this is really important, now a recent report from last month from Harvard says that in 59 countries, when planning the reopening of schools, only 25% of these countries involve parents in the opening. So important, yes, but not completely involved. So what, and to finalize, I think it's hard to imagine another moment in history where the central role of education in the economic, social, political prosperity and stability of the countries is so obvious, is so well understood by the general population. Now, how are we going to make education stronger? How are we going to capitalize in this support to make human rights education stronger? When we are arguing that's what we need to prepare children for a future which is changing and crisis might come. There are new roles for school, new roles for teachers, for civil society as well. So some questions for you to finalize and to think about. Yes, this has been a huge experiment. How, and in Tromsø, we talk about a lot, the recommendations emphasize the need to use more online learning to deliver human rights education. What is the right combination for us? We are talking about developing knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values. What is the right combination for us in doing so? So this is something we need to explore. What is the relevant for us? Then the digital world, and that was mentioned by Spirata just before, the digital world is bringing a new set of human rights issues. We are talking about big data, about e-participation, media literacy, cyberbullying, well-being online, how to manage online identities, and so on. A number of things, rights and responsibilities, privacy issues. How are we preparing educators to address them? How are we supporting them in doing that? How well prepared are we as institutions to deliver that? And the last one is, I've never been so much recognition of the public, the role of the schools, the educational systems in coping with the crisis is huge. Now, if we are going to reimagine education and skills for the future, how are we going to support education professionals in doing so with a very strong human rights perspective? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for those three excellent presentations. And we have really set the ball rolling in terms of the challenges. Calamity versus opportunity. And certainly the technological challenges come in together with the humanizing challenge of the whole perspective of online and beyond. I will first of all raise three questions which were sent in before the web conference. This is with due respect to great participation from our friends. And then after that first round, we'll come round to the more recent questions that have now been pitched on the Q&A just now. So I know also that there's been a bit of a technical difficulty in regard to Zebrapar's connection. So perhaps if we could just set the ball rolling by asking Frank and Anna to try to respond, and I can also jump in a little bit to join. And Zebrapar, when you come back on, please come on board as soon as possible, because we welcome that very much. Three questions, particularly from those submitted before the web conference. Number one, what should governments do to fulfill the right of access to education and human rights education in times of COVID-19? What should governments do? Maybe a 1, 2, 3 would be quite interesting to list. What do we need from the governments? Number two, ICT has become an essential tool for teachers and students. How can governments and the UN support access to ICT to reach vulnerable communities to continue studying? And number three, what about the other methods of obtaining education besides online learning, particularly in view of the challenges of developing countries? Those were sent in before this web conference, and they deserve a good response from all of us. And then I'll raise some other questions which have just been pitched to us. Thank you. Frank, would you like to start off?
Yes. Oh, those are excellent questions indeed. We had many of them, so it was hard to choose. The first one, what should governments do to fulfill the right to education and human rights to education? I don't think the pandemic has changed that. Governments have an obligation under international law to provide access to education, access to quality education as well, and including education in, about, and for human rights. And this is, with the COVID pandemic, of course, this an added dimension comes in terms of actually providing infrastructural access to education, through guaranteeing internet connections, maybe even subsidizing online access as one small example. So yes, governments, the right to education is a human right. Up to the age of 18, every global citizen is entitled to access to education, to access to quality education, and governments need to make all the resources available that they have to provide that access. And in these times of COVID, I would say that they should particularly focus on providing access by guaranteeing internet connectivity, by providing phone cards, for example, so that students can and professionals can access internet and hence can access education from outside classrooms. That would be my quick answer to the first question.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we have three very wholesome questions which need a lot of thinking. Frank, if I could just interject a little bit. There is an issue of money And even in times of COVID, we want governments to sustain as best they can resources for education, and by implication, human rights education. So I think that's a major call. It's certainly a major call from the UN with regard to the most recent appraisal of the situation affecting 1.6 billion people. So don't forget resourcing, but resourcing is not just money either, as we will hear from Anna. Anna.
Thank you, and thank you for your questions. They were very thorough, and I would need hours to go into depth with that. But I would say, regarding the fulfill the access to education, the first thing I think that the governments have to do is to map out what is the situation right now, how this has affected different communities, because we know the rich communities, the most affluent communities, they might hire tutors but others are not able to do that. So just to have a kind of an understanding of what the situation is, because then they will have to rethink positive measures to address those most vulnerable communities. And if I may, I'm going to mix the three questions, if I may, but because you also ask about the ICTs and the support, and I will put the resources into that. One of the key, I think, lessons from this is that we are all on this together. So the strategic partnerships, how we are going to reach out, and then this is governments with ICT providers, working with local communities, with institutions, all of this together, how we can solve the issues coming up, because it's the whole society which has a problem. Is 20% of their kids are dropping off. So it's the issue of how we rethink these strategic partnerships. And I would advocate to put public schools at the center of it. The public schools are the center of the school, and their role as a really important institution in societies has been reinvigorated, because it's obvious. That's the Frank said heroes. Yes, this is exactly what they were. They work overnight and they continue delivering this. So how we can work out different types of partnerships that really help address the issue and bring in these vulnerable children that might be in risk of dropping off. And I am concerned as you about resources, because I see different governments and they are putting the emphasis on health. They should, of course, and then is the economy. But we are education for the future. So we really need to make our case why this is important, because we are not talking about this is one crisis now, which is a pandemic, but then we have the climate crisis, then we have the economic crisis, and more crises coming. So our role is to educate the young generation to cope with the future, which is changing, which is uncertain, which is vulnerable. So this developing these competencies, this resilience to elaborate responses to that. This is education. So it's not less important that putting the emphasis on the economy and so on. So I think concerning the resources that are needed to cope, we need to really be quite strong about what is at stake here. And it is a very particular moment in time, as I said before, because everyone understands, it's obvious, the role of education for the stability and the prosperity of each country.
Thank you very much. That's a very good series of reflections on those three questions. Any more reflections on those three questions before I move to the next? We have a whole list of others. Anything else? You've just heard from Anna. I think the issue of resiliency is a very good one as well that was raised in terms of partnerships and peer assistance along the way, together with parents and teachers and so on. It's not a hopeless situation unless we see it as hopeless, and we don't want to see it as hopeless. We see it as also
maybe one short comment. This is good timing. The UN General Assembly is coming together. Well, not some people are coming together in New York, mostly online, and of course this is a very opportune moment to really emphasize the need to invest in education, to put resources aside for education, both at the global level, at the UN level, but of course primarily by governments. And my impression is that is happening, that more resources are made available for education, but the approach varies from country to country.
Anna, anything else before we come to the next 3 or 4 questions?
And then the last one, I didn't answer to the challenges, and it says, what is besides online education, what other means we could use to address especially the issue of access to education? And I would say, you mentioned I am from Argentina. I talked to my friends there, and they have been in lockdown for 6 months now, schools completely closed. And the teachers were telling me, well, you know, we don't have computers for every child. So what do? We use everything available. So we use WhatsApp. We work with parents. We use radio. We ask for the local TV to give us some slots. And so there's a whole range of things, but more importantly, it's what teachers are doing. They are really looking at the situation, the homes that need a visit actually, and they're working with the parents just to really care about what is going on. So it's a range of possibilities. It's not just super sophisticated, but see what you have at hands and how you reach out. It's about including them. It's about delivering something so that they don't get behind. So teachers are really good at that. They are doing a magnificent job.
Thank you very much. Well, that's a very realistic panorama being offered. It's not an either-or situation. We use everything we have in terms of the means. And I think this will respond to quite a lot of the questions about this lack of access to internet or lack of access to online question, which has come through a lot, actually. So I'm going to read out 3 or 4 questions that have come through the discussions at the moment through the Q&A. And if there's time, I'll go back to the pre-submitted questions later. So first one is thinking about informal education for children of marginalized communities. What would be the best medium to approach them in the absence of connectivity? So that's a bit linked to the earlier questions too, but this can be elaborated upon. So informal education as linked with marginalized communities and lack of connectivity. Secondly, what's the best way to implement the right to education during COVID, where there's no access to internet? Thirdly, if online is to become the new normal, how do we equal the playing field? How do we equal the playing field? And behind all that, appreciation of the comment about redefining teaching and the need to find and provide proper teaching materials. And this is a question to Asef, actually. Asef, do you have any programs on this? And what do you see as appropriate education materials? So those 3 or 4 can be responded to by any of us. So I'll come back to Frank and then to Anna, and I hope Superpower will come on board sometime if possible. Thank you. Okay, Frank, please.
Again, really excellent questions, which could take us hours to respond in all the nuances. I think one thing to emphasize when we speak about absence of connectivity is that have been historically, we've used all kinds of ways to access education. Remember, maybe correspondence courses, theater. There's so many different ways of, like Anna also just indicated, that teachers can be creative, looking at, okay, what is it that I'm trying to teach? You know, what it is that students, pupils need to learn, and how can we realize that? And this could be from, you know, doing little projects to simulations, etc. And of course, in these times of COVID, we have to make sure that we guarantee, you know, distance. But it's certainly not limited to online learning, and that's why I'm not advocating, you know, that everything should be online. I'm advocating for blended learning. We need to use as many modalities as possible. So I think it's the third question is, I don't think online is becoming the new normal. I think creativity is becoming the new normal. We become, as educators, we have to become more creative of how we can make students, professionals, others learn in general, but also specifically about human rights. And I'll leave it to Anna now, and I'll come back to some of the other questions.
Right. Thank you. Back to Anna.
And back to me, and thank you again. I think for me, creativity, as you said, Frank, and innovation. Innovation is actually at the center of it. It's how do we manage to cope? How can you put together the bricks in a different way? I read somewhere that it's about now what we need is the ability not to think outside the box, but to think without a box. That's our situation right now. So how do we innovate? How do we use the best of this to learn from our experiences, to learn from what didn't work? That is as important as to learn from what worked. As Frank, I would advocate, and before working in education, I worked 15 years with the NGO dealing with distance learning worldwide. So this is very close to my heart, but I also know that it doesn't work for everyone. And concerning human rights education, we need to really figure out what is the model that is relevant and works for us in our context. And in every single context, so it's a range, it's a combination, is to dare to imagine how we will address this issue. I think that also comes to the rethinking of roles post-COVID. We are at a time where we need to rethink roles. What is the role of the school? And I said, I think particularly private school has been so strengthened by this as a center of the community. And maybe schools, they need to, because this is another issue we didn't talk about, but what people are very concerned about is the mental health of young people being isolated for so long. So this is coming more and more. And when you talk to young people, and research shows that this is their main concern, this isolation and this sense of crisis and catastrophe. So schools will have to take a lot more, look more into how to support the well-being of the students. Teachers again, from being the ones in front of the classroom with all the knowledge, more supporting students' learning, giving advice, motivating students, and so on. And then is the role of civil society that I think also, and coming back to how do we address these vulnerable groups, I think the civil society has a really pivotal role, particularly in securing continuation of day-to-day activities for vulnerable groups. So this is an opportunity also for civil society to really mark how important they are, to reach out, to do things, particularly informal learning, to communities that do not have it as easy as the others. And there is, for example, concerning learning materials, someone mentioned there as well, it's really important. It's really important to have quality online learning materials which are age appropriate to different groups and to different contexts. We need much more than that, and some things exist, but still I think the most important part is to contextualize it. You cannot have one size fits all. Something developed in a highly developed country will not necessarily be appropriate for another context. So working much more in supporting education professionals with appropriate quality online learning materials, I think, is key. And I saw another question coming here from the audience that I think we need to say something about. And it's someone said, home school cooperation affect differently women and men. And then I have to say that it is a big concern, because gender equality has gone decades back with this, and this is affected. Someone from Germany told me that the pandemic has made the situation and the equality going down by decades, because still when the kids were at home, parents both have jobs. There was one parent, usually the mother, that was in charge of that and neglecting the job, and while the father did that. So it's a perspective we need to really look at, because this will last for quite a long period.
Thank you very much. I have good news. Siprapa can hear us, I think. You might not be able to see her, but she's online, and I hope that she can provide some additional comments in a moment. We have other questions coming in, and so I'll read them out and then invite you to respond to some of them. One other question is the difficulty at the moment facing human rights education. One of the challenges is that human rights education is not a separate subject at school. And under COVID, how should it be infused or integrated into education in times when it's not a separate school subject? And another question came in. Can you highlight some cross-country experiences of human rights education e-learning, please? E-learning. Thank you. So I'll invite Frank and or Sivapa, any of you can take. Thank you. Sivapa, are you on board? We'd like to hear you. No response yet. Can I go to Frank then, please? Either of those questions that just came in.
Thank you, and I'm hoping that Sripapa will have a better connection, because I very much would like to hear her response to some of the questions. The first question, whether the challenge of HRE, human rights education, not a separate school subject. This is an ongoing and a very long discussion, even way before the COVID-19 pandemic, whether human rights education should be a separate subject matter, or whether it should be cross-curricular. It should be addressed in different, if I speak about the schooling sector, elementary, secondary, and high school, whether it should be integrated throughout the curriculum, with languages, math, history, civic education, if it exists. And so this is it's an important question. And in many countries, I think there's almost no country in the world, except when there's an educational reform, it has proven to be almost impossible to have human rights education, human rights as a separate subject matter. That's from a practical perspective. From a more theoretical perspective, and I think Anna Perona can also confirm this, there is more and more an emphasis, a realization that human rights is, of course, not just about the knowledge, but it's also about attitudes and values. And therefore, the concept of human rights in schools, human rights friendly schools in which students are active citizens, they participate in decision making, human rights as part of a community, sort of a human rights based approach to schooling, as it's called, has been much more prominent in the past few years. Now, how do we do this under COVID-19? It's definitely taken more of a backseat, for sure. It's not one of the core subjects, nor core curriculum targets, and so this has been very challenging in under the pandemic. And I hope that now that we come to sort of a new normal, hopefully a blended learning, schools are reopening, sometimes closing, that human rights education in schools at least will no longer have a backseat and regain some of that territory. Yeah, I'll pass the next question to Anna.
Anna, please, thank you. Any cross-country experience learning?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. We're on to a couple of questions that have just been addressed to us. One is examples, cross-country examples of e-learning, and the other was responded to by Frank. What do we do with a separate course on human rights or not? But what do we do in times of COVID? And Frank's already responded.
Okay. I may add a few things if you can hear me. I'm actually outside my house now because there is no signal at my place. One thing about e-learning, I think quite a number of us with this COVID-19 are now trying, online learning, which I think is important, but the problem is still about language. For example, we are producing online courses and we already got some of them, but because it's all in English, so it might not be accessible, to some nationals, or especially for children. The second one, how to do this human rights education at school level. Again, I think this is actually the quite a crucial time, because during this COVID-19, we see ongoing human rights violations. And I think, the teachers can pick up any of them in order to show, as I think Frank has already mentioned, that human rights education is not just about knowledge, but about, attitude and behavior.
And you see so many things now to point out to students. Secondly, a separate course of incorporated into existing course. Actually, we could do both, but what we are trying to do is to ensure that human rights education is properly, introduced. So we are advocating for having at least 1 or 2 separate courses to be introduced at both school and university level. And in fact, in ASEAN, human rights course, at least 1 or 2 courses were already approved. Introduction of human rights course were already approved by the ASEAN Senior Official of Education. So actually it is for member states of ASEAN to implementing it.
Very good. Yes, Anna, please, yes. Did you want to add to that, Anna? Please.
Yes, I would like to say that the separate or not separate course on human rights education and democratic citizenship, from the European perspective, the latest educational reforms, they have gone, most of them, away from a separate subject. I know Romania is not the case, it's the opposite, but most of the others, they put it at the top of the educational system, with being one is human rights and democracy, the other is environment and so on. The problem with that approach might be because it's everywhere and it is maybe nowhere. So if you are not very much aware of that and so on, it's easy to forget. So that might be the problem. At the same time, it's really preeminent politically. So it's the implementation that makes the difference. But I would argue also that it's coming really much more in this whole school approach I just spoke about, because human rights education is not just about the teaching and the learning in the classroom, but it's also about the school culture, which needs to be embedded in the same principles, and the school communities, which is the relation between the schools and the outside community, parents and others. So this is all the complex where the human rights educations need to be embedded, is not just in the learning part, which in the classroom. And we'll see that and this is what I was referring to when it says the homeschool cooperation is coming so central. Then this is part of the whole school approach that we have been advocating for years now. So we have an opportunity to say, well, look, that's what we can also contribute with. And particularly the school culture, the inclusion of all the students, what is happening outside the classrooms is particularly important. And then the other question concerning cross-country e-learning experiences, I have to say that there is one element. I don't think we are all doing e-learning, to be honest, and to be fair to those that are experts in e-learning, that have been working for decades in that. We are experimenting, most of us. We are taking some elements of e-learning and experiment, and it's which really good is learning by doing. But I would really recommend to team up with those that are really experts in the field, because they will help us to understand what the possibilities are and what do we need. The pedagogical side of it is not the technology, it's the pedagogy of it, and to help us understand the possibilities and the limitations for us as well. So for instance, we have teamed up recently with the Open University of Catalonia, which is a virtual university, is one of the biggest in Europe, is created as a public virtual university 25 years ago. So we are working with them to develop our new blended learning model, because they know and we know what we want to do, but they help us to figure it out how we can make it better. So there is also a possibility to reach out to others to help us to tailor-made a response which is relevant and appropriate.
Thank you very much. Some more questions coming in. Yes, one here. How do we change the mindset on education, rather than seeing it as a burden on teachers, but sharing it more? And then how to ensure that what is learned in the classroom is linked with reality, the experience, learning by doing, perhaps through apprenticeships and internships. That's one question. The other, which has just come on board, how do we ensure that with online education, how do we ensure that no one is left behind? And what if there's a gap between the graduates and the resource persons? And what are some of the steps that we should take at the local level? Thank you.
If I may pick up the question on how to, ensure that no one is left behind. I wonder if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. I think one of the problems that I have already mentioned in my talk earlier was about internet access and the fact that digital providers are mainly, private sectors. You hardly see the public sectors are owning the means of communication, in this case, internet. So I will be advocating for right to internet, that everybody can get access to it, so that communication and connectivity is possible. Because without connectivity, many people, I think billions of them, will be left behind. I already mentioned about the proportions of people do not get access to internet, for example. The second one, of course, we cannot rely just on, online learning. One of the things that I see in a very good example, very good practice, when I travel to one of the provinces in Thailand, in quite a remote area, but the borders between Thailand and Cambodia, where you got students from the two countries learning together. And in between, there is a no man's land. Of course, they cannot get access to internet, but still, with the willingness and generosity of the teachers, mainly from Thailand, they built a camp or a tent in between the two countries, no man's land, so that the students from Cambodia could get access to education without any disruption. At least what they are doing. I think this kind of gesture actually is to ensure that no one is left behind, even if without internet access. The third one, which is also important when we talk about online learning, is just not about digital or internet. It's also, television or radios. And we know that in many places, televisions and radios are, available. And I think with this, with more means of communication, of connectivity, although it may be a one side or one way communication, but it is still better than nothing.
Thank you. Frank, any other responses to those new questions?
Yes, I think in terms of framing the discussion, maybe the term distance education is more appropriate, because it allows for different models of learning, from radio, television, to correspondence courses, to online learning. And because ultimately what this pandemic is about is that it's all about distance, right? So I think that helps us a little bit sort of reframing the discussion. As to the question about how to change the mindset, in my personal experience working with professors at the university, who all of a sudden, as of March, were told, okay, now you have to go to Moodle. You will no longer see your students because they stay home. I think many of them have been grappling with that. And it does require a change in mindset. And initially they were in survival mode, emergency mode, as Annapurna mentioned. But I think slowly but surely they are thinking, and I'm talking just exclusively now about university instructors, they're thinking, okay, I tried to convey certain knowledge, sometimes certain skills. How do I do this? What are the ways to do that? I used to just lecture, provide some reading materials, and then have a seminar to go a little deeper. But how can I, given that in a way we have a larger toolbox of learning modes, how can I match the learning objectives, the competencies that I want my students to learn, to know about, to develop. How can I match those with different ways of reaching them, of teaching them? And I think that's a big challenge, but I think the coronavirus pandemic really forces us to do that, whether you are an elementary school teacher or an instructor in higher education, or you're a police trainer in human rights. It requires creativity and innovation. And I think we are forced to, we don't have a choice. I'll leave it to that.
Thank you. Anna, any additions, please?
Yeah, I would say that I come back to what I said earlier. This is an experiment, and the opportunity is that we explore new things. The risk is that we stop there. So I agree with Frank, and it says what is really important for us, but when we are experimenting, as we really take the time to evaluate and to reflect and to understand what it is valuable and what do we bring forward when this situation is over. So it's this evaluation part, and particularly this is really important for educational authorities. And I know that in many countries they have already set researchers following the whole process because they want to learn from the experience and they want to see how this education might be changed in the future. And this is the case also for several universities. So following the process in order to learn for the future. And then I'd like to mention, someone says about the learning by experience, and this is something we didn't touch upon, but one of the most affected sectors is vocational education and training, because it's so much focused on being there on the job to learn through the internship and this kind of learning by doing experiences. This sector has been extremely affected by the pandemic. So I don't have answers, but it's just to raise this, and it says how educational authorities will cope with that, because this will be almost 1 or 2 years complete disruption for thousands of young people in that sector.
Thank you very much. We have some more questions coming in. One new one is how to tackle early marriage, particularly where it's proliferating now due to COVID. That just came in, and I can raise some others from the cross-section of questions that were submitted before the web conference. Some general ones maybe. What are the fundamental principles of human rights to be addressed in this crisis? Presumably through education, that's what we're talking about. Secondly, can SDG goals be changed, if at all, after COVID-19? So you have 3 there, sort of broad question and 2 specifics. One specific is early marriage. Second specific is SDGs, can we change or not? And third, more general, is what human rights principles should we be highlighting at the moment? Thank you. Sipapa?
Yes, actually the electricity is coming and I'm trying to put on my computer again. Yeah, I pick up maybe 2 of them. One is early child marriage, which is, this is one of the concern, but not only during the pandemic. Maybe, the situation is getting more serious. And in the past, we were thinking that educational system, especially the formal one, would actually hold, students in schools in order to delay, their marriage. But because the school is no longer there because of the closure, so I don't have much solutions or clear answer here, but I just want to mention that this is the real problem in many corners of the world. The second one, which is about what rights that we should be paying attention during the pandemic. As I mentioned in my presentation, that actually all rights are related. And a few things that we already see, not only right to internet, but also, for example, right to food, right to nutrition, nutrition for children at schools, because they are not there any longer. But I think maybe the most critical, especially for parents, are actually right to work. In Thailand alone, we see that 14 million people in Thailand are now jobless. So you see how critical the impacts of COVID-19 is. So actually, with no right to work, no employment, then yeah.
Okay, time's a bit short. Anna, maybe 1 minute, and Frank, 1 minute.
Okay,
Please.
I will just, the Sustainable Development Goals, will they change? I hope not. But would certainly change is the fact that 2030 will not be possible to reach them. So, my concern is that the one on education probably will not be the one that will get the priority seat this time. So that's what we need to fight for.
Very good. Frank, a final word?
Yes, in terms of principle, which human rights should be prioritized, of course, the standard answer is they are interconnected. But I do think that the right to work and the right to education are extremely important, and I do hope that governments continue to support those that are unemployed, that are on furlough, and other ways, because if people cannot make a livelihood, then many other rights are affected. The SDGs, I'm afraid that we will be set back by many years. I don't think they will be changed. They will probably just not be realized by 2030. And I leave it by that.
Thank you. Very realistic approach. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for the great contributions. I would just round off in thanking our participants for sending in excellent questions beforehand, as well as presently, and in thanking everyone. A few thoughts from humbly me, and it sort of fits in very concisely in almost 5 points, but with a preamble of 2 points. So the preamble of 2 points is this. Of course, it is a calamity, but it's an awakening. It's an awakening. We're waking up to use whatever means we have. So feel also the energy of change. Everyone has changed and being changed, like it or not. And we want constructive, positive change. And in that perspective of transformative, catalytic change, we want to deal with the negative side of limiting it. And one element that came through was how the structural divide is enlarging. Poor, rich, internet access, no access, gender, and all kinds of other issues. We bear that in mind to deal with it, because we're not going to give up. We want to transform it through energy, through the awakening of doing something better. And in that perspective, when we ask ourselves implementation of the rights, there are tools that are common to us, but we have to use them well. One is planning, and we heard about the need to map well the situation, to deal with it well. As a lawyer, I won't talk about law, but I'll just say policy planning, very important. Money and more resources, keep it up. They're still spending money on buying submarines, you know, at the moment. Shift it to education, for goodness sake. Thirdly, on implementation, education in the broadest sense, interconnected. Use whatever education you can, formal, non-formal, informal. It's so blurred at the moment. I'm teaching from my bedroom. What's that? You know, it's not quite formal necessarily. So use all the means of all forms of education and partnership building. Students, parents, teachers, and beyond. Of course, the governments who should be accountable too. So 5 roundups very quickly. Number 1, an issue that was not raised too much, safety. We have to plan well to get the kids back to school safely, because they will go back to school, and it's a safety issue. And this is being emphasized by the UN also, so I want to raise it. And of course, in the interim, of online or not online to ensure that that's also safe, because online is often unsafe as well, and it's been raised. Secondly, adaptability. And that is very much to do with access to technology and beyond. And we've heard some wonderful ideas here. Of course, we need online, but we need more than online. We need to have offline activities, use whatever means we have. So distance learning through a variety of ways and means, technological, no tech, or middle tech, whatever, and use whatever means we have in terms of flexibility. Mobile learning, school visits through teachers going out rather than waiting for the students to come in, and so on. So adaptability, flexibility, very important, using all the means we have. Thirdly, sustainability. We have goals. We might not achieve them, but they're still good goals. And it's very much to do with resourcing as well, in terms of commitment of the governments, the SDGs. We're not reneging, but we know that we might not fulfill, but we still aspire to attain, and we do our best. And in that perspective, the internet issue is already in the SDGs in terms of the need for full access to internet, what we're now claiming as the right of access to internet for everyone. And that's also implied by the SDGs. Fourthly, resiliency. Tap people's resourcefulness, capacity to revive, exist together, motivate them, peers helping peers, interaction between formal, non-formal, all kinds of personnel coming in. Homeschooling was raised several times, and that means different personnel, the parents, the teachers, the kids, and so on. Cooperation across the board, across borders, through camps near the border or whatever, as well as the innovation that comes in through the sense of resiliency to try and do better and not give up. And finally, what I would call inclusivity, meaning attacking gender issues, we shouldn't forget, attacking marginalization issues, attacking discrimination issues, none of which we should forget, which means promoting, again, back to square one, not only the knowledge base, but also the attitude of everyone and the skills, the behavior, not only of those in marginalized situations, but those in power to act responsibly. We've heard about the need to catalyze judges, politicians, beyond. So address vulnerabilities, but also address the power structure or the power destructure, which is often destructive in terms of lack of symmetry in terms of power relations. Well, those are some thoughts, and I wish you very much stepping stones of a positive kind. You or I may reach far, far, but I don't think we need to reach very far. Just start at home, actually. Beware of the mental issues, the psychological issues coming in from stress factor. I think a major issue to working together, stepping stones. Start small, reach out. Let's move together and beyond. Bye for now. Thank you very much, everyone. Clap to the panelists, particularly the three of them, and all the participants. Thank you very much. We are almost, we're on time plus, and we're going to switch off with many thanks to everyone. Thank you very much, Asif, and all the participants. Thank you.